Good afternoon. Welcome to the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice on this November 18th, 2021. Due to the distance, health, and safety concerns, members of the public are not in attendance at this meeting, but full access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication. This allows members of the public without cost to listen using streaming as available. The agenda for this meeting has been posted on the Public Square website and may be requested from the Office of the Governor by emailing Kate Davis at kansascrej@ks.gov. Each member of the commission and staff will state their name and title each time the individual begins speaking or voting, so all the individuals can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure that microphones, phones, or other electronic devices are muted when the participants are not speaking, so the ability of remote listeners or observers can be heard during the proceedings and it's not unnecessarily impeded. Public comment will not be allowed at this meeting. During the meeting, the commission will not recess to a closed or executive session pursuant to KSA 754319. Each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the committee, and the chairperson will announce the results of the final vote. Again, good evening. I'm Dr. Anderson, the superintendent of Topeka Public Schools. As we begin, for those that, when you are talking that are in the room, if you must pull down your mask, it's fine to pull it down to make a comment if you must do that. Other than that, we do ask that everyone maintain their mask throughout the course of this meeting. At this time, I'll turn it over to my co-chair, and let me say, when we conclude this meeting, the co-chair and I, we're so excited to see everyone in person at our first in-person meeting. Nothing like a 2-year wait to see all of you. And for those that are online, we're excited as well to have you join us remotely. When you prepare to leave, both Dr. Portillo and I have sweet potato pie and a few treats on the way out, as well as a holiday ornament with the emblem of the CREJ. I'll turn it over to Dr. Portillo.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. As Dr. Anderson mentioned, I'm Dr. Portillo, co-chair. We are excited today to finalize the recommendations in our report, but before we do that, we will have one last presentation for our commission, and that is from Commissioner Teresa Miller, the CEO of the Kansas Health Foundation. We are excited for the data that she'll be sharing with us today. We'll turn it over to you, Commissioner Miller.
As the PowerPoint comes up, is your microphone fully on, and are you a little bit closer to the microphone so those online can hear you well?
There we go. Is that better?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, perfect. All right. I think we can jump to the next slide then. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today, and it is really nice to be in person. I was a latecomer to this committee. I just moved to Kansas 6 months ago and started as the president and CEO of the Kansas Health Foundation. So I'm excited today to share with you some of the data that I have presented to our board over the last 6 months. And just real quickly and real briefly about the Kansas Health Foundation. At the foundation, our mission is to improve the health of all Kansans. And we invest about $20 million a year to improve health and build stronger communities. During our July board meeting, we discussed some of the data that I'll be sharing with you today, and also agreed that as we head into strategic planning, which we are doing now, that we want to focus our future work on health equity and reducing health disparities. And as we'll see today, health outcomes are significantly impacted by factors like race and income. Okay, next slide. I think historically, many of us in the health space, and certainly Kansas Health Foundation, we have health in our name. Often I think we've confused health with health care. And sometimes we've acted as though those things are really synonymous. But in fact, only 10 to 20% of our health or our health outcomes are attributed to healthcare services or access to those services. And even when a lot of us as organizations brought into focus kind of the social determinants of health, looking at things like access to food, housing, education, we still tend to focus on the individual rather than really looking at their surroundings. But where someone lives, their zip code, and what we'll be looking at today are really census tracts, even more granular than zip code. Where someone lives has a huge impact on their health. And it can be much more powerful, in fact, than their DNA. At the Kansas Health Foundation, we are using data to identify communities throughout Kansas with the greatest disparities and then plan to target our resources in those communities. So today I'm going to share with you some of the data we've looked at around life expectancy and look at how it varies based on where you live in Kansas. We'll also talk about some of the demographic changes that we will see in the coming decades here in Kansas and look at some other specific data around disparities. Okay, so this next slide is a very busy slide, and I'm just going to highlight some of the pieces on that slide. But what we're looking at here is the census tract in Kansas with the lowest life expectancy. And as I've shared this data with a lot of folks at this point, I haven't surprised anyone by telling them that the lowest life expectancy census tract is in Wyandotte. That people seem to expect. What I think surprises people is that the life expectancy in this census tract is 62.5 years, which is 27 years lower than the census tract that has the highest life expectancy, which is in Johnson County, just about 10 miles away. So just a couple of the data points I'll highlight in this slide. In this census tract, you have a median household income of $12,487. 57% of the households in this area are living below the poverty level. The unemployment rate is 25.5%. And then if we look at some of the demographics, which I think are key, nearly 58% of the residents in this tract are Black, and 75% of the residents are Black or Hispanic. So contrast that slide with the next slide, which is the census tract in Kansas with the highest life expectancy, which I mentioned is located in Johnson County. So here, the life expectancy is very close to 90 years compared to the 62.5 that we just looked at. The median household income is over $96,000. Only 6% of the households live below the poverty level. The unemployment rate is 6.6%. And if we look at the demographics of this census tract, it's nearly 3/4 white, and there's actually a significant Asian population in this census tract as well. So we can go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about redlining now because there's such a correlation between redlining and life expectancy. So redlining is a term that's used to describe the federal discriminatory housing policies that grew out of the Depression era and essentially left people of color out of the new suburban communities that were created. The term redlining comes from the color-coded maps that were created by the federal government of every metropolitan area in the country. The color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages and where African Americans lived, and really anywhere where African Americans lived nearby were color-coded red to indicate to appraisers that those neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. These policies have had really long-lasting impacts on these communities. Today, African American incomes average about 60% of white incomes, but African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. We know most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity that they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s by the FHA. And so they gained none of the equity appreciation that white families gained. So suburban homes in the 40s and 50s sold for about twice the national median income. They were affordable to working class families who had either an FHA or a VA mortgage. And African Americans were equally able to afford these homes as whites were, but they were prohibited from buying them. Today, these same homes sell for $300,000 or $400,000 at a minimum, which is 6 or 8 times the national median income. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that allowed African Americans to now buy homes in these suburban areas, but it's really just an empty promise because those homes are no longer affordable to the families that could have afforded them when white families were buying into the suburbs and then gaining that equity and wealth that followed from that. White families were able to send their children to college with their home equities. They were able to care for their elder parents. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. And none of those advantages accrued to African Americans who were, for the most part, prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs. Okay, so now we're into impacts of life expectancy and redlining and looking specifically at Wyandotte. So you can see here with these two maps the impacts of redlining and the disinvestment that really resulted from that. It's no accident that these maps track so closely. Historically redlined areas have fewer resources like quality schools, access to fresh, healthy food, access to healthcare facilities. We know redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. And so that lack of investment in houses meant that they fell into disrepair. That led to health hazards like mold and lead paint. Industrial sites were more likely to be located near redline neighborhoods, which meant just more exposure to pollution. And as areas declined, retailers, important retailers like grocery stores, left. And that meant, of course, that there was less access to healthy food. These neighborhoods also had less access to parks and other green spaces, places where people might exercise. All of those factors contributed to create an environment that's just much more conducive to poor health outcomes. So I'm going to throw a couple numbers out at you. So the statewide life expectancy, if we look at the entire state of Kansas, the life expectancy is 78.6 years. So keep that number in mind, 78.6 years if we look at the entire state of Kansas. The blue areas on the right here, so the red are historically redlined areas. The blue areas on the right are areas that have the lower life expectancies in Wyandotte County, and those are at 75.3 years or lower. And it's hard to see here, but the census tract we just looked at is the tiny one right above Kansas City on the map, if you could see that. And that tiny little census tract, that is one of 13 census tracts across Kansas where life expectancy is less than 70. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And this slide just shows the same comparison in Wichita. And again, you can see that strong correlation between areas that were historically redlined and areas today that have the lowest life expectancy. We can go to the next slide. And this is just drilling down even further in Wichita and Sedgwick County. So this slide shows 7 census tracts where life expectancy is below 70 years. I mentioned just a second ago that there were 13 census tracts across the state where life expectancy is below 70. 7 of those 13 are in Sedgwick County. As I was interviewing for this job, I was trying to learn more about the population health in Kansas, and so I was doing a lot of Googling, and I found a Washington Post article from 2018, I believe, that listed Wichita as the 3rd most redlined city in the country, which surprised me, but then it actually made this data around life expectancy make a little bit more sense. 64% of the neighborhoods in Wichita were marked as hazardous in the 1930s, which frankly is not far behind the #1 redlined area in the country. Okay, next slide. So as we've been looking at data, another data point, life expectancy was a big one, and I think that's just a great gauge of the health of a community, so that's an important data point to look at. But another data point that we're looking at is really the changing demographics that are coming over the next several decades in Kansas. The Kansas Health Institute issued a report a few years ago that really detailed the shifting population demographics over the next 5 decades, essentially. And the report noted that our population is aging, it's becoming much more diverse, and much more concentrated in urban areas. The white population is expected to decline by over 20%, while the Black population and Hispanic populations are expected to grow substantially over the next 5 decades. Notably, the Hispanic population is expected to nearly quadruple by 2066. That's an increase of almost 287%. The report also noted that there are considerable racial and ethnic disparities in the state when you look at health status and related social determinants of health like poverty and education. Per capita income in the state is highest among whites. And minority groups, and I use that term recognizing we had a nice discussion about this term. I think as we look at the changing demographics, we really have to reanalyze whether we can use the terms minority and majority. So I'm gonna rephrase and say non-white groups in Kansas experience substantially higher rates of poverty. For Blacks and Hispanics, 1 in 4 of each group is living in poverty in Kansas, while the poverty rate among whites is 10.6%. And these disparities have existed for many years. Disparities also exist regarding education attainment, which of course is linked to socioeconomic status. While only 6.4% of white adults 25 and over have attained less than a high school education, that rate among Blacks is twice as high at 12.8%, and that rate among Hispanics was 38.7%. So I'm new to philanthropy. My background is government. That's where I've spent many years. And so when I see these disparities, I immediately start to think about, what happens when I think about, for example, how we fund state government and the services that we all rely on, whether that's our roads, our education system, our healthcare services. When we think about these disparities and we think about the changing demographics and the fact that in 50 years, our Black and Hispanic populations are going to make up a majority of our tax-paying citizens, and their poverty rates are much higher than whites, what does that mean for how we're going to fund taxpayer-funded services? And so all that to say, this is just one of those data points I think we're really looking at to say we've got to pay attention to this. And the more we can do now to address these disparities, the better off we're all going to be, because again, we all rely on taxpayer services. Our futures are really intertwined. So I think this is one of the reasons we need to focus on this, and quickly. Okay, next slide. So this slide looks at the population projections in the areas that we identified with some of those greatest disparities and the lowest life expectancies. So in Wichita or Sedgwick County and Wyandotte. And in these areas, we see that these areas are growing. And again, we see the rural areas are moving towards these more urban areas. So the demographics are going to increase and they're going to get a lot more diverse. So again, this is just going to intensify these health disparities if we don't find ways to address them. Next slide. And then we also have looked at some very health-specific data, which doesn't look too different in terms of when we see the disparities as like the life expectancy data. But the next couple of slides just show some of the, and this one's a good one, the health disparities around hypertension and diabetes. You can really see the significant disparities between the Black and white and Hispanic populations. And then the next slide is back to looking at those maps. So again, these are looking at obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and high rates of these. And these maps, as you can see, all look very, very similar. And if we were to look at the red line maps and the lowest life expectancy maps on top of these, they all look very, very similar. And again, Sedgwick County, it's the same thing. In addition to looking at the health data in these counties, we also looked at income and poverty data because we know those are significant factors as we think about health and life expectancy. And you can see the just really significant disparities in median household income in these two areas. I think in particular, if you look at Sedgwick County, the difference between Black and white households is just pretty stark. Next slide shows children in poverty. And once again, you can see the significant disparities in the number of children in poverty. Again, if you look at Sedgwick County and the difference between white children in poverty and black children in poverty, I mean, you've got 9.8% of white children in poverty and 47.4% of black children in poverty. Just pretty stark data. So given the impact of zip code and really even census tract, as we've looked at it on health outcomes, at the Kansas Health Foundation, we plan to target our efforts in communities where we see some of the greatest disparities. And as we continue to look at data, as you saw today, I mean, we see a really consistent pattern. Those areas that were historically redlined are the areas where we see the worst health statistics and the greatest health disparities. As we've been putting all this data together, someone sent me a news clip from a local TV station in Wichita from, I think it was the beginning of 2019. They did a great story that looked at a lot of this data, and they were looking at obesity rates today and comparing them to redline data, and they showed the old redline maps, and they put the obesity data on top of it, heart disease, diabetes, all kinds of data, and you can just see all the maps are the same. So it really, I think, shows us where we need to be focused, and we've got our work cut out for us. There's a lot of work to do, as you can see from the data, but I also can't think of a more important body of work to be doing right now. So I'm really excited to be here and be focused on these issues. So with that, happy to answer questions or hear people's reaction or comments. And thanks for the opportunity to present today.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's terrifying data. It's data that are really important for us to see, and also just shows how much work we still have left to do. Do we have any questions for Commissioner Miller?
As we open the floor to questions, this is Dr. Anderson, Superintendent of Topeka Public Schools. I had the good fortune of seeing some of this data in advance at an equity council and in her first meeting about some of the things she was uncovering. So Commissioner Miller, my first question really is from the perspective of the Health Foundation, your efforts moving forward, taking into account the reports that we've done up to now. Are there some ways in which you anticipate in the immediate future you'll be using some of the report that we're doing now in terms of your work? You talked about targeting it to particular neighborhoods, but can you talk a little bit more about that? And then if you can expound on some of the recommendations we've made thus far, if there are areas that you feel as though really all of Kansans should really focus some collective impact effort on, that would be helpful just to hear your thoughts on both of those.
Thank you for that question. So I see our work as we go forward, and we still have strategic planning that we really haven't quite started because we've been doing kind of an equity analysis first. But as we move forward, I think we are going to be doing some very specific place-based work, and certainly Sedgwick County and Wyandotte County are areas I think we're now trying to explore further. What I said to the board at our most recent board meeting is, we know what the data says now. Now we need to really get in there and start talking to the potential partners and people who've been in these communities working hard, doing the day-to-day, how do we improve our community, and looking for, who are our partners and how do we, especially since these aren't really areas we've targeted in the past, how do we come in and work together as a true partner in a meaningful way to kind of help address some of these issues? So that's kind of the place-based work. But I think some of your comment gets to kind of the policy side of things. And I didn't mention this, but a lot of the discussion we've had as a foundation also is how do we expand our policy footprint and do more in the policy space? So historically, we have supported Medicaid expansion, and that's obviously a really important policy that's been pointed out by this committee a couple times. But as we think about the disparities, I am a big believer in Medicaid expansion. I came from, Pennsylvania most recently, where we expanded Medicaid, and it made a huge difference. But when I look at these disparities, Medicaid expansion would certainly be helpful. It's not going to address these significant disparities that we see. And so we really need to think about, how we get at the root causes of these disparities, which means we need to have conversations that we're having as a group about things like systemic racism. So as a foundation, we've talked about, engaging in policy efforts around things like criminal justice reform, which as a health foundation is not a space we've really been before, but it's one that our board is really interested in because they understand that connection between systemic racism and the health disparities that we see today. So criminal justice reform is one area we're going to be working on. And to your question about the recommendations, I mean, one of the things I've done is as soon as I got on board, I looked at the recommendations that came out last year around law enforcement. And I think I said this to the governor, when I look at those recommendations, I realize we at the Kansas Health Foundation are not an expert in any of those areas. But the beautiful part is a bunch of really certified smart people came together and came up with a bunch of recommendations. So part of what I want to do is work with local entities who might be in a position to implement some of those things and figure out if we can be a funder, if that's what they need, or some other partner in trying to advance some of those. I just hired this week a policy person. So we're going to have someone come on who's going to spend 100% of their time doing policy work, because again, if we want to get at some of these root causes, we've got to disrupt systems, we've got to change policy, and we've got to change systems. So I think the policy work actually becomes really, really important. And one of the things I want to do with the recommendations I know we're going to go through today is sort of take all the recommendations that this committee has put forward and walk through them and figure out where might the Kansas Health Foundation have impact, and which of those policies do we maybe want to pick up and run with and find other partners who are working on them and figure out how we can help advance the cause. So there's a lot of work to do. The place-based, I think, is kind of a very specific, I think we need to invest in these communities that we as a society have intentionally divested of kind of all resources. I think that's a piece of the work, but then I think the policy piece, in my mind, is just as important as we go forward to make sure we address some of these. I hope that answers your question.
No, that absolutely does. Thank you. And I would encourage, just as when we get to the part of rollout, for us to really be thinking about how do we educate and roll out if they didn't know some of the data she uncovered. I would suspect that many of our communities don't know life expectancy and some of these other things that have been shared in terms of the data, which gets to the question about that data for my county, for Dr. Lewis's county. I know you focused really kind of where the Health Foundation is. Is that accessible somewhere for the public or for those of us that live in other areas or just want to educate communities? Because the data looks very similar no matter where you're at. But is there a particular source that would be good for us to look at even after this?
I believe we got the life expectancy data from KDHE and data that they put out there publicly. And then if people are interested, there is, and I know I passed it along to folks, and I'm happy to share it with this committee, there's a website that you can go to that I think folks worked on for years to make publicly available, that you can look at the redlined areas, the historically redlined areas. You can even see the language that some of the folks who were working for the federal government that wrote on there that's pretty difficult to read, frankly. But you can see all that. It's all publicly available now. So there's a website you can go to. You can kind of zoom in and really kind of see what your community looked like in terms of the redlining.
So we'll send that to Ms. Davis. If we were on Zoom, we'd be putting that in the chat. That was shared with our Equity Council, and it's powerful. So I think everyone in the public being able just to have that level of awareness. I'll stop there and yield the floor to other commissioners regarding quite a bit of data and information that was shared.
Go ahead, Commissioner McCormick.
Hi, this is Commissioner McCormick. Thank you for that presentation, by the way. I grew up in one of those census tracts, 67214. I was curious, were there data points that surfaced that surprised or shocked you that did not make the report?
Sorry, I need to keep remembering to turn that on. The life expectancy, and I wouldn't say it shocked me because when I was in Pennsylvania, we looked at the same thing across the state and saw you know, if you walked from a redlined area to a non-redlined area, your life expectancy changed by 25 years, depending on, you know, where you are. So, so I'm not sure that surprised me. And I also saw in Pennsylvania, we did the same, kind of looking at maps of food insecurity and poverty levels and education levels and life expectancy, and you just see the same pattern. So I think if anything, it didn't surprise me, but it was just interesting to me coming from another state where I looked at this data to see that it's the exact same situation here. And my guess is in a lot of states that that's the same kind of situation.
How you doing? Brandon Davis, the University of Kansas. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me was it seems like this is undergirded by poverty. And with Wyandotte County, I can't remember if you said the unemployment rate for Sedgwick, but Wyandotte County having 25% unemployment, that's like depression level unemployment. And if poverty is the bedrock of where the problems are growing from, how does the foundation see addressing health issues through the guise that poverty is the issue? Because, you know, people say economic development, but really what you mean is 15 years down the road, 10 years down the road. So that means nothing for the people right now. So I'm trying to see how you're looking at the poverty in conjunction with the health issues, because poverty is not something easily solved, you know, like quickly.
It's not. I mean, and I think you're exactly right. I think what you see, and it's interesting. So the job I came from right before this one was, I was the secretary for the Department of Human Services in Pennsylvania. And so we were the agency that if you look at all the 3 million clients we served, the one thing they all had in common was poverty. And so I think, you know, race plays into it because of the disproportionate impact of poverty on people of color, right? But poverty is the underlying issue. And so one of the things, you know, when I was going through the interview process and talking to the board about this work, one of the things I said is, you know, if we're really serious about addressing health disparities, number one, we need to know we're not going to impact any of the data that I just mentioned in a couple of years. We need to know that we're in this for the long haul. In a decade, maybe you'd see some changes. In a generation, hopefully, that's where you'd see that. But in 3 to 5 years, you're not going to impact life expectancy data. I mean, and we just need to know that. You're not going to address these issues of poverty overnight. So we need to know it's going to take a long time, and we need to also find partners. We can't do this alone. Kansas Health Foundation, none of us are big enough to address this alone. But I think we really need to start having some conversations about income inequality in this country and certainly in this state, because I saw, and we've had some of these conversations as a commission and some of the committees, I saw just how poorly we as government are really serving people in poverty. And, you know, the TANF program in my mind is a great example. That is not helping anyone get out of poverty. And we've allowed that to go on for decade after decade. And so it's time for us to have some of those hard conversations about how do we change this? Because again, with the changing demographics, if we don't figure out how to address this now, we're all going to feel this in the coming decades when we're trying to figure out how to put a state budget together and we're not sure how we're going to pay for things.
Thank you. I have one last question. Is there anything about social welfare uptake? Because I know you just TANF, and you know that it doesn't really work, but SNAP is really effective on reducing poverty, especially like food-based or food cost poverty. And because they have categorical eligibility and broad-based categorical eligibility, it would seem like that everybody in Wyandotte County may be eligible for SNAP if they got 25% unemployment. So about an immediate program of like pushing people to get into SNAP. So at least it'll take the food cost burdens off of their living costs, will give them some kind of breathing room.
Yeah, I think that's something that we could absolutely look at. I mean, I hope we can solve these more long-term, but you're right. I mean, SNAP is a very effective program. I think it could be even more effective in terms of helping to connect people to jobs and things like that. But it certainly helps in the near term.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo, and just a preview for some of our upcoming recommendations. We will have some recommendations around SNAP coming out of the Economic Subcommittee that Commissioner Miller served on as well. I know that we have some commissioners joining us online. Do we have any questions from commissioners joining us online?
You do. This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. Thank you so much, Commissioner. That was a great presentation. I think really information and education is extremely important. I love the fact that we're bringing Wyandotte County to the forefront. The disparities in Wyandotte County, the health situation in Wyandotte County, the economic situation in Wyandotte County has been known for years. And so I appreciate you and your foundation for looking at Wyandotte as well as Sedgwick to really do a deep dive into where you can be of great help. My question to you is, as you get on the ground and you're working with these organizations who've been there, one of the things that I do know is that much of the information that you're talking about, redlining and the disparities throughout the history of government and in our country, many of these organizations are not privy to this information. And so many of these organizations are doing work right now to help the current situation. But what are you all, or what can you do to really educate them on the reason behind how things got to where they are? I think that is extremely important, because many of those folks can't really be ambassadors of that real change if they are not educated on how it actually occurred. And so again, thank you, and thank you for your presentation.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things we're trying to do is get this information out there. So I'm doing any kind of presentation, anywhere I get invited, I am sharing this information, and we are putting it out through all kinds of entities, outlets, any way we can get this out there, we certainly are. And I think, to your point, the thing that's been surprising to me as somebody new coming into Kansas is, as I've talked to folks, for example, in Wichita, and shared with them the data and the fact that, you know, Wichita was the third most redlined city, I say all that, and I'm always expecting them to be like, well, of course, you know, I've lived, and instead people are like, wow, I didn't, people who've lived there, who've been involved in work there. So I think you're right. I don't think people necessarily know this data, but as we do more work in these areas and engage more with folks, one of the things I plan to do is to make sure that this data is part of that conversation. I think we want to be really respectful of the entities who are doing work in here, and certainly don't want to just sort of come in and start taking over. We really want to be true partners, but I think sharing the data to explain kind of why we're interested in this area is part of how we'll have those conversations. And I think part of how we can help is we have to change the narrative a bit, and we have to explain, and I think data is a great way to do that. Why are we focused in these areas? Because we may have folks in some of the rural areas wondering why we're not spending as much time in rural areas. Well, because here's what the data shows, and I think the data is really hard to argue with. So I think everything we do is going to be really grounded in data to explain why we're doing what we're doing and why we're doing it, where we're doing it.
Thank you so much.
Do we have additional questions from commissioners joining us online or anyone here in the room with us?
This is Commissioner Anthony Lewis, Superintendent of Lawrence Public Schools. Thank you for this presentation. It's not a question, more of a comment. And one of the things I appreciate about the intentionality around this commission, because a lot of these issues that you shared with us today is multifaceted. You know, it's not, we just can't look at the Health Foundation and say, fix this. You know, as we think about poverty, education has a huge piece to play in that, in terms of, you know, quality education being linked to socioeconomic status. But understanding that, and the work that the economic subcommittee is doing, there's some redlining in housing lending. There's some cognitive redlining that's happening in our classrooms. And so I appreciate the report, but also it creates more of a sense of urgency for me as an educator to want to do something about this. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Agreed. It was a great presentation from Commissioner Miller, and I think it underscores how this work's really aligned with taking on some of these tough issues. As a state, we rank 47th out of the 50 states in the amount of federal dollars we bring back. So it's tough for any philanthropy to make systemic change on their own without those resources to put to use. From an early childhood standpoint, and I think this administration has done a great job, and I think it's for us, how can we back it up to make sure that we can stem the two generations, take a two-generation approach of helping parents and children by addressing some of these early childhood issues. The policy really does make a difference, and how can we make SNAP and TANF work better in Kansas for everybody? I think some of the recommendations around the HOPE Act are great. So I think it's exciting, and I'm glad this presentation really wrapped things up.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I guess I just have one last question. You brought up in the presentation that this is something where we're all going to be in this together because we see these intergenerational wealth divides that have happened because of redlining, and they're disproportionately affecting communities of color. Communities of color are becoming the majority in our state. And so this will affect the tax base, this will affect communities throughout our state. When you give these presentations, and you mentioned that in many communities, people are surprised to hear some of these data, how do we make sure that everyone can get on board together to push for some of this policy change? Is it just sharing the data? Is there something else we need to do to ensure that people are ready to have these conversations?
I think that's a great question. And, you know, it's why I tend to focus on the data, because I think the data is just hard to argue with. You know, I think for some of us, we have a moral imperative that we need to do something about these disparities. And I didn't put this in the slide. In some of the presentations, I talk a little bit about, you know, the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on communities of color. And, you know, I think in some ways that probably got our foundation really looking at this more. And so I think for some of us, you see that and you realize, like, there's a moral imperative for us to act because it's been way too long. And none of these disparities are new, as we saw today. So my hope, I know that not everyone feels that moral imperative though. So I hope that by talking about, that's one of the reasons I had the slide in there where I talk about kind of the future, because our kids all go to, at least many of our kids go to public schools. We care about funding for public schools. And so hopefully there are ways we can all see that, you know, whether we like it or not, I mean, we're all in the same boat, and it's really, our futures are intertwined. And hopefully the data, I think sometimes data just helps take emotion out of issues that might be difficult. And so that's why we tend to just really focus heavy on data, because it kind of tells the story. And then hopefully we can get people on board. And we may not have everyone on board. I don't know that we'll have everyone in rural areas across Kansas loving what we're doing, but it explains why we're doing what we're doing. And you don't have to like it, but I think at least people will understand, looking at the data, why we're doing that. And then I think for us, it's really about using that data to find who are other partners who are like-minded, because it's going to take a lot of partners to get this done. And I've been really encouraged by a lot of the conversations I'm having that there are folks who see the data and are saying, yeah, let's do something about this. So I think if we find enough of those partners, we're not going to win everybody over, but hopefully then we can get some momentum for actually making some positive, lasting change.
This is Dr. Anderson, Superintendent of Topeka Public Schools. To that point, that level of urgency that was mentioned before, if nothing else, it pushes that. You know, at the end of the day, programs come and go. So like in our report, we don't have lots of programs. Systems remain. So, you know, she talked about systemic racism. Programs come and go with the leader, the money, the budget, but systems remain. So this is about dismantling systemic practices over time, which goes back, I also think, to our rollout when we get to that at that very end. Whether it's Commissioner De La Rosa's community, where the rollout would look different, how it's said, whether we talk about the level of education through webinars. I know that'll come up a little bit later. But for us to think creatively, even beyond the first report, how we roll this out so that we're not just sharing, here are the recommendations, but educating, here's the why behind the what. So even some of that data that's so powerful and so stark, here's the why behind the what, and giving people that same sense of urgency. So that's, for me, food for thought for all of us as we think about people can't wait 10 years and 15 years. So systemically, what are things that we can do to dismantle systems and at the same time create new systems with a collective group of individuals? It is 3:45. Are there any additional questions? And if not, we're preparing to go into the report. This is a great segue into the report. Turn it over to Secretary Burns-Wallace.
I just want to say again, thank you for sharing. I think as we do think about the rollout, and as the chair has just mentioned, the thing that you said that really, I think, resonates with me is that if we stay in the why of the moral imperative, people go turn a deaf ear. But when you really turn that data and think about the recommendations we have here, and you show people, if you don't do this, this is how it impacts you. You see this as an other issue because you don't believe it's yours. But part of the power of what we can show through the recommendations, through the data, is that this will impact your entire community, not just what some may consider the other, right? And so when that imperative is not solely moral, but it impacts your economic bottom line, it impacts the future growth of your community, it impacts what you want in terms of economic development coming into your community and people, what you want the future of your community to look like. If you aren't addressing these issues now, you won't get there. That changes the way someone engages with the issues that we are asking to be taken up. So I encourage us, as we do get to that rollout conversation, to think about how do we help communities understand and see this is not an issue of the other, right? It is the issue of the entire community. And without addressing what you believe may be the other or one sector of a community, then it actually has the ripple effects on everything that community's future looks like.
Thank you. This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I think that that does help us really get into that discussion of recommendations, because these recommendations that our commission is putting forward are meant to help the entire state and to really build off of what Commissioner Miller mentioned when it comes to the data and how we can use data to tell a compelling story for where we'd like to go as a whole community. And so Ms. Davis is going to pull up our report so we can start going through the recommendations. There are also paper copies for those of us who are in the room that have just the recommendations that we have left to approve. And I will pass it back over to Dr. Anderson, since the first recommendations are in your area.
Give this a moment for everyone to get the paper copy. As that paper copy comes by, Secretary Burns Wallace, your statement reminds me of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King makes a quote in many of his sermons, quotes John Donne from The Bell Tolls, "I cannot do well unless you do well." And that's what this is about. You cannot do well unless I do well, because we're all interconnected. And that interconnected piece and understanding that as the majority population or will be people of color, and if right now they're in poverty and will be in poverty, we're all in trouble. So that level of understanding, I appreciate your comment. I think everyone does now have a copy of the report. As we start with early childhood, and I'll looking at, I see at the top, there are the highlighted areas. So let me make sure that we're not repeating.
Yeah, and I will say, Dr. Anderson, this is.
What we have are just the highlights, is that right?
What you have printed is just the new ones. What I have is in yellow if it is new. And a lot of these have kind of intermingled. So I believe this first recommendation came out of the healthcare subcommittee, but is under early childhood. So there'll be some back and forth on where some of these are placed now.
Thank you. Commissioner Jordan, do you want to speak to the first set under early childhood and child care, since it came out of the health committee, and then I'll turn it to tax policy and I'll pick up from there?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. The first recommendation is to recommend that the administration adopt the DC 0 through 5 crosswalk. It's a way to ensure that young children aren't categorized with a severe emotional disturbance and that diagnosis follows them through life, so that you could crosswalk to a more appropriate diagnosis. This is a challenge where there's no other way for clinicians to diagnose children with some minor behavioral problems for billing purposes, and then that diagnosis hampers them throughout life. So this would help avoid that situation. Any questions on that? The second recommendation is to a legislative administrative recommendation to continue and increase investment in therapeutic preschools. So those preschools that are able to not just provide learning opportunities, but have the ability to support healthy development of all children and address some special needs for children, and particularly behavioral health. And the last recommendation, and I think this might have been from another committee, is to ensure quality initiatives in childcare systems include equity indicators in areas such as curriculum, pedagogy, inclusion, and behavior management. Any questions?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I will take the tax policy discussions that came out of the Economic Subcommittee, as hopefully everyone has.
Sorry, if I may briefly, do we want to approve these as we go and turn them green?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll take my cue from you guys if they're ready to be turned green.
So before we move to the tax policy, should we go ahead and take that vote of if anyone has any disagreement with these top three under education, early childhood and child care?
Seeing no disagreement, we will move on. Thank you. Hopefully, all of you have heard the plan to axe the tax around food tax. We are one of the few states that still has full taxes on groceries, and this severely affects families that have food insecurity. And so we do support the governor's position to remove and completely eliminate sales tax on food in the state. Our committee also discussed expanding the homestead property tax credit to include renters. As we know, as the presentation from earlier this afternoon just mentioned, communities of color do tend to be disproportionate renters throughout our state. And so by expanding the homestead property tax credit to include renters, this would lower the tax burden for many families of color. Any question about either of those two tax policies? Seeing no questions or disagreement, we will change those green. And I will hand it back over to Dr. Anderson to discuss teacher diversity.
We have 6 items under teacher diversity. The first one was to incentivize a second language fluency for teachers and other staff in educational institutions. Increase and fund pathways for individuals employed in school districts. Collaborate with local educational associations or other groups who can help provide equity training and assist with recruitment efforts. Provide incentives and structures to engage teachers as mentors and encourage mentorship by teachers who come from underrepresented groups. Develop programs that incentivize the hiring of individuals who live and work in the neighborhoods where they teach. Then districts should create policies that support and protect diversity among students, teachers, and staff. Some of these recommendations came out of the KNEA presentation that we last had, as well as some of the earlier conversations. Are there any questions or disagreement? Not seeing any, we'll ask that you turn all of those green, please. Moving on to post-secondary education, we have 3 additional recommendations. Provide resources to post-secondary institutions so that they are less reliant on student tuition and to close enrollment and graduation gaps. I actually think that also came out of the Economic Committee in addition to ours. I believe the number 2 also came out of the economics as well as the education. Create an improved free application for federal student aid, FAFSA completion process for students, and to ensure a smoother process for students from a 2-year college to increase access to baccalaureate programs. Then the third is to encourage initiatives aimed at providing more access to college for incarcerated individuals. Any disagreement or questions on those 3? I'll turn it back over to my co-chair. And I believe part of that's yours, and the land acknowledgements fall in our areas. So I'll turn it back over for housing and homelessness. And the amazing part about this, many of these recommendations that came out of education also came out of economics, also came out of healthcare. So it's hard to even see and distinguish, which I think is a good thing. It speaks to the social determinants of health. and the overlap. So the next two universal equity policies is to enact legislation that requires bias and equity analysis of policy decisions and legislation at all levels, as we heard here from Commissioner Miller in many ways. And the second one is to encourage government entities to incorporate land acknowledgements in their facility planning efforts. In fact, Topeka Public Schools will be approving that this evening, the land acknowledgement for the land on which we sit in Topeka Public Schools and making an acknowledgement to those tribes. Any questions about those comments or disagreements? Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Anderson, I just have one proposal. I like both of them. We were talking a little bit earlier. I wonder if we would want to consider adding another one similar to enacting legislation, the first one, but encouraging government entities to incorporate bias and equity analysis of policy decisions at all levels. I'm just thinking about whether you're a state agency, local government we were talking about earlier. I think all of us could benefit from sort of that same analysis of policy decisions as we make them. So I just wanted to offer that up.
So the insert for Ms. Davis, the word you're inserting, can you repeat that statement, please?
So I think it might be a completely separate one, but it would be along the lines of number one, that would be encourage government entities to incorporate bias and equity analysis of policy decisions.
So I wonder, Ms. Davis, and perhaps will this get to this, Ms. Miller, the enact legislation, would it be encourage government entities and enact legislation? And then the rest of the sentence reads, is that satisfactory? Okay, and again, this is Dr. Anderson, Superintendent of Topeka Public Schools. With those changes from post-secondary through universal equity policies, are there any questions or disagreements? All right, with that, we'd ask for you to turn that green, and I'll turn it over to my co-chair.
Thank you. This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. We will be moving on to a discussion of housing and homelessness policies. Our first policy here is to explore community land trusts as a path to making home ownership more accessible. Our second is to develop a stipend or loan program for code enforcement and small replacements. This is really aimed at avoiding situations where homeowners may lose their home because of small costs of repair. Our third is to explore options to assist homeowners in paying for utilities and property taxes. Again, ensuring that ancillary costs don't affect folks losing their homes. Our fourth is to explore options to provide access to counsel for individuals involved in eviction cases. Right now, there's no affirmative right to counsel when going through administrative hearings for evictions or eviction cases, so this would be exploring options to provide counsel for folks. And then update discrimination statutes to include protection against income discrimination. We had a great presentation around how income source discrimination can often be used as a proxy for racial discrimination in housing. So by protecting income sources, we can do away with a proxy for racial discrimination. Our next area is to address the appraisal process to allow a more cohesive understanding of a buyer's position in the housing market as compared to their surrounding areas and competition. This is really aimed at eliminating discrimination within appraisals and ensuring that we're being intentional about the comparable sales or comps that are being used in this process. Our next is to hold banks responsible for foreclosed properties and their upkeep to ensure that foreclosed properties don't affect the values of homes in surrounding areas. The next is to support the use of the collective impact model to reduce homelessness through intentional partnerships. This is really building off of some of the work, again, from the Education Committee and from the Health Committee to make sure that we're seeing this as a systemic issue and working with all partners in local communities. And then our final recommendation in this area is to replicate and fund models with a proven track record of reducing homelessness. This is really to ensure that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to this really complicated problem, but making sure that we're using evidence-based practices that do exist to eliminate homelessness across the state. Questions, comments, or additions to any of our housing or homelessness recommendations?
Madam Chair, one suggestion for maybe an addition is the the potential to leverage Medicaid to support investments in safe and adequate housing and prevention services. Other states have used some Medicaid dollars for some preventive services, and that might be an option.
That's a fantastic addition. Ms. Davis, did you get that down? Yeah. I think this would be a new recommendation.
This is Commissioner De La Rosa. I'm not sure if I wasn't present, in some of those meetings, but one of the things that I deal with and working with the immigrant communities in Southwest Kansas, specifically with refugees, DACA recipients, and others, there are some households that either the parent or the youngest kid in that household have employment authorization under the immigration code. Oftentimes what I've seen, and it's the reality today, is that not all lending and entities allow employment authorization documents to seek a loan. That's an issue for a lot of the households in immigrant communities because that's the only status they have in certain households. And so in many cases, what we've seen is until you have citizenship or green card status, it's the only time that you get to issue a loan. And in a lot of instances too, when they allow employment authorization to be approved for lending, the interest rate is higher in many instances.
Thank you, Commissioner De La Rosa. What would be the specific recommendation for the commission then? Would it be encouraging banks to consider loans using work authorization or something different?
Right. I don't have language to propose. I'd be happy to work with Ms. Davis, but, and again, not knowing exactly how the lending sector works, I think it would be encouraging lending entities to consider that as a requirement or at least a minimum requirement to be able to own a home.
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. As we are at this state of the report, can you repeat that sentence? Because perhaps that language itself might be the language that we offer to continue within this timeline of the report and also to come up with something thoughtful. The other part that I would just encourage you were specific to a particular type of documentation. So if we're going to say encourage, perhaps encourage flexibility might be one of the words to add into that. Because there might be some other avenues that could be used even beyond this. So can you repeat the sentence of the encouraging, the lending practices or the statement that you just mentioned, and then we can tweak it from here?
Definitely, and I apologize for that. Commissioner De La Rosa, again, encourage lending entities to allow individuals with employment authorization to seek a loan or a home loan.
So Ms. Davis, if you have that down, and then I would propose that when you add employment authorization, I don't know if flexibility needs to be somewhere in there prior to that particular word, so that if it's not employment authorization, we're flexible in what other forms might be qualifying in the future. Since this report made now, there might be some other opportunities. Thank you for sharing that particular item. I was going to speak to a comment, not necessarily a question. The collective model and the reducing homelessness, both Wyandotte and now Topeka, there is a program, Impact Avenues, which they reduced student-based homelessness by 50%. It's pretty amazing. So they approached Topeka a few years ago, and now our homelessness is reduced significantly and is becoming a model. This is a program already in place, and the collective model is really just getting everyone in the backbone of the city together 1 day a week. Sounds almost too simple to be true. Homeless people walk into a space, all of the services, SNAP, everything that normally takes 6 to 10 or however many weeks, they're right there. They renters, all of these other people, and they leave the space not homeless anymore, all in 1 day. It's pretty remarkable, but it's not like we have to reinvent that. What it does mean is we have to know that it exists, which if Wyandotte had not reached out to Topeka Public Schools, we wouldn't have known it exists. And it's now replicated and being featured. So I would just encourage again, that's the why behind the what of number 8 and 9, things that have a proven track record, that we're encouraging people to identify it, work to replicate it. But the collective model, it takes everybody in the city to get behind that, and it can be reduced literally within a year or two significantly.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Seeing all of those turn green, we will move on to broadband. Our recommendations for the broadband section really come out of the Kansas Office of Broadband Development, which was just recently developed. As we know, broadband is an incredibly important part of our economy these days, and ensuring that we have access to broadband throughout the state is an important part of what we're doing. So our first recommendation is to support the Kansas Office of Broadband Development in its efforts to expand broadband across the state. And the second recommendation is to maintain a perspective that supports equity in the implementation of broadband development. So really ensuring that we have that universal equity in all policies approach when we're thinking about broadband and expansion at the local and state level. Questions, comments, or additions to our broadband recommendations?
This is Dr. Anderson. I don't have a question, but a comment. And I know, was it yesterday? I think Secretary Burns-Wallace, I think I saw you on the stream of the broadband. I think it was in Dodge City. And so she's a commissioner there for perhaps other roles, but that Spark broadband, as that's rolling out and the distribution of that, I think as commissioners, if we know those dates and when that's live streamed, it's helpful. In this case, it was a lot of colleges speaking, but it's helpful to know what they're saying and what the inequities are. So we speak from a platform and or do op-eds that are really speaking to this issue. I know I learned a bit from that, in addition to not just knowing it from a K-12 perspective. So that's just an added comment. And those webinars are regular. So I don't know if even on our site or how when we roll this out, being as commissioners, advocates of that information, because broadband to me is a game changer for Kansas. It really will be.
Do you want to?
This is Secretary Burns-Wallace, and I know that it's not one of the areas that we're going over today, but there is a section of our report where we mention specifically ARPA. What I would note is, for instance, the infrastructure bill, which was just signed, which is not a relief bill and not related to ARPA, has a whole contingent in it just for broadband and connectivity, including equity-related components. Some of, as it'll become clear in the next probably couple of months, there are parts of the new infrastructure bill around things like broadband that specifically say to be competitive for the dollars, you must demonstrate the collaboration into certain communities, census tract communities, so that these dollars are being leveraged. And so states won't even be able to apply unless you can demonstrate that you already have those relationships, those connectivities. And so I just mentioned that, as you mentioned that we might look at our language earlier in the report that is around ARPA, and we might even make it a little bit more broader to say, ARPA and other things, so that it doesn't just give a nod to ARPA, because there are other bills that are coming out now that really should be considered as these dollars start to flow into the state. The issues of equity, maximizing the dollars at the federal, state, and local levels, that the issues we are bringing up, whether it's broadband or all of these, are that we're looking for the intersections to ensure that the dollars are being used in equitable ways.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I think that gets at what Commissioner Jordan was saying earlier as well, that Kansas ranks near the bottom of bringing in some of those federal dollars. We need to be very intentional as the infrastructure bill and hopefully the Build Back Better bill come into play, that we're actually being strategic about that.
This is Dr. Anderson. So I'd almost say, while we'll whether we turn that green or not, there's a comment then to be made about the earlier part of the report, and those were turned green, or maybe some note to return back to that. The Emergency Broadband Act, in presenting on that to Congress, one of the things that I highlighted that's not actually in our report was about the impact to the tribal areas and to Native Americans. And so I think maybe some tweaking of some language is certainly appropriate now with this new legislation in particular. And just that language is already written. I spoke directly to it, and it ties right into the most recent infrastructure bill. So if we put a note somewhere, even if we turn this green, to go back to that, if that's okay with the rest of the commission.
Yes, so this is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. So it sounds like we'll turn the current broadband recommendations green, but then add a note for those earlier ARPA recommendations to make sure that we're being inclusive of current infrastructure legislation and future federal legislation. We already have the language of making sure that we're centering equity in implementation at the state and local levels. Thank you for that quick movement through our report, Ms. Davis. We appreciate it. And then it looks like I'm just going to keep going through some of the work from the Economic Development Subcommittee. We're moving on to wages and lending practices. We have 3 recommendations here. The first is to increase the state minimum wage and index it to adjust for inflation. So the biggest piece of this policy change is really to focus on that indexing to inflation so that minimum wage doesn't become stagnant, but really does evolve as our economy evolves. Our second recommendation is to establish limits on high-cost lending practices in Kansas. Other states have done quite a bit of reform, particularly our neighbors to the west in Colorado, and so really learning from what they've done to reform the payday lending industry. And then the final recommendation in this area is to create stipend opportunities with realistic repayment forms while holding loan recipients accountable to reduce risk of program exploitation. So really, this is asking us to replace the predatory lending practices with a program that does allow for revolving credit that Kansans can still access, but without the high stakes that current practices have. Comments, questions, or edits for this section? Okay, we will move on to workforce. And we have 4 areas that come out of here. And a lot of this is really thanks to the work of another commission looking at apprenticeship programs. So our first recommendation is to support the recommendations in the Kansas Registered Apprenticeship Work-Based Learning Expansion Initiative report. So really focusing on those recommendations and the role that they can play in increasing equity. The second recommendation is to invest in a culturally competent and diverse workforce, particularly in the healthcare sector. The third recommendation is to update the statute to allow for hiring more Kansans in healthcare fields, really looking at some of those statutory policies. And then the fourth recommendation is to build systems and structures to support deployment of community health workers to bridge access gaps in underserved communities. Any questions or comments?
And if I may, just very briefly, this is Kate Davis. That Department of Commerce Registered Apprenticeship Work Group, Commissioner John Nave was a part of that, so he recommended those, and there's some intersection there of the work that was happening. And then I know some of those recommendations did really come out of the healthcare subcommittee, so I don't know if Commissioner Jordan wants to speak at all to those last few.
I'm happy to speak to them if there's any questions.
Seeing no questions, we will turn it over to you, Commissioner Jordan, for the next section.
Great, thank you. In terms of the healthcare, access to healthcare section, we had 5 recommendations. The first, to expand Medicaid. The second is to collect data in the state around racial equity and access to healthcare services. The third is to improve language access and interpretation services in the healthcare field, and there's several sub-recommendations under that in terms of Medicaid reimbursement and credentialing for providers. The fourth is support express lane eligibility to streamline access to Medicaid and CHIP. And the fifth is to lower the amount of time for legal child immigrants and non-citizen residents to have to wait to access to Medicaid and CHIP.
This is Commissioner De La Rosa. I just not opposing any of these recommendations, but more or less adding to the conversation on language access. I know this is particularly or specifically in the healthcare field, but you know, being a public servant with a city in Western Kansas and dealing with you know, or representing 4 of the counties that are majority Latino or Hispanics and other races. One of the things that we are seeing is that specifically in rural areas or rural cities, the concept of language access or having bilingual services available, it's probably strange to them, for lack of better terms, and it plays a very important role, not just in healthcare, but also in emergency services, 911. We recently had a situation where somebody, carbon monoxide issue, where they didn't speak English or Spanish, and so they were speaking more dialect, Quiche, in Guatemalan languages. And so having those services available in those situations plays a very critical point there. Not also emergency services, but core systems, and then other basic local government services. And so specifically local governments and also state agencies. I know with the Kansas Hispanic Latino American Affairs Commission, we worked a lot on COVID-19 education and training. And one of the things that we noticed as people were accessing where to get tested or where to access vaccine, the page in Spanish was not necessarily as available and accessible for our residents. And so taking a look at, the broader spectrum on government services, on language access, it's important to me.
If I might recommend, I think that might be a good recommendation under the universal equity policies. So I can work on drafting, it can reference this one as well, and I'll talk with you about language.
Yeah, I kind of think I missed my window here, but on the, can I go back one? On the wages and lending practice number 3, is it possible to put in some wording for credit reporting? So if you're going to give them loans and they're going to repay it, we can report to the credit agencies so they can get some credit for it?
That's a great suggested addition.
Thank you.
If there's no questions on the access to healthcare section, we can move on to the family planning section. Under the family planning section, there is 3 recommendations. The main recommendation is to ensure the availability and affordable and accessible contraceptive care and contraceptive methods to Kansans, particularly that the state should pursue a state plan amendment or innovation waiver that allows for access to comprehensive services. The second recommendation is to increase eligibility for family planning services under Medicaid to 171% of the federal poverty level, consistent with what we cover pregnant women up to. And then the third recommendation is to improve access to contraception under private health insurance plans. Does anyone have any questions or additions?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I think it may just be helpful in that second recommendation to add that second sentence that you mentioned in the description, because it's not currently in the report, that we cover pregnant women under Medicaid up to 171% of the federal poverty level, just so that we know where we got that number from.
Okay, so that it's consistent.
Yes.
Thank you for the suggestion. No more questions. We'll move on to the behavioral health section. In this section, we have 14 recommendations, so I'll go through them quickly. The first recommendation is to expand telehealth access to codify regulations that expanded during COVID-19 to ensure continued access to coverage. That includes payment parity as well as the ability to access sites remote and distant from a clinic. The second is to utilize app-based mental health services in Medicaid to improve access to care for young adults. The third is to support and finance the use of mobile crisis models, including co-responder and virtual co-responder models, to assist law enforcement in responding to behavioral health calls and stops. The fourth recommendation is to increase the use of mental health first aid training, crisis intervention training, and other behavioral health trainings for new and existing officers. The fifth is to build relationships between local government, law enforcement agencies, and other entities to provide a robust behavioral health services in community. The sixth is to increase access to mental health care in educational settings. This includes coordinating between local governments and school systems, expanded hours for school-based behavioral health centers, ensuring that schools can become Medicaid providers, leveraging national and state resources, partnering with strong supportive agencies like FQHCs and community mental health centers, offering services in multiple languages, funding and supporting policies that expand school-based mental health, and increasing state investments in early Head Start and similar programs that ensure eligible families with young children have access to mental health services and supportive services where they live and work. The next recommendation is to research and develop strategies to successfully integrate mental and behavioral health services into physical health care. The eighth is to ensure confidentiality is maintained for all Kansans seeking behavioral health care. The ninth is to employ strategies to broaden coverage so that Kansans have access to preventive behavioral health services. This includes using state dollars to provide coverage for youth regardless of immigration status, strengthening the ability of hospitals and other providers to enroll folks using presumptive eligibility, removing citizenship questions from enrollment forms, permitting some same-day billing, leveraging Medicaid managed care contracts to carve in mental health, allowing preventive behavioral health to be provided without diagnosis, especially for infant and toddlers, and providing resources to early childhood learning to provide services in culturally appropriate languages and settings. The 10th recommendation is to conduct a statewide assessment to identify gaps in funding and services, as well as the use of best practices and proven models. The next recommendation is to assist individuals seeking behavioral health to enroll in Medicaid if possible. The 12th is to improve data tracking and coordination between systems within behavioral health. Next, we have increased the availability of infant childhood mental health consultation services. And finally, seeing the recommendation on workforce 2 on workforce diversity to include behavioral health workforce. Any questions?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. This is a comment more than a question and very minor. Healthcare has quite a few acronyms all over the place, and throughout the report, we do a fantastic job identifying most of them, but I just caught federally qualified healthcare centers. If we could add that before the FQHCs, just for ease of reading through things.
Thank you for that, Co-Chair Portillo. This is a problem with healthcare in general. There's way too many acronyms. My board has asked for like a cheat sheet for our board meetings, so we need to do a better job in healthcare. So
one of my research centers, we always do a laminated bookmark with all of the acronyms, which just shows that there are too many.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you. Unless there's other questions or comments.
I just had a quick comment about the first bullet point. It seems to me that telehealth will make broadband that much more crucial.
I agreed, Commissioner McCormick. Okay, we'll move on to ACEs and interfamily violence. Under this section, we have 6 recommendations. One is to improve coordination and partnerships to increase prevention services and guard against ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences.
And that is defined in the report. Thank you.
Second is to support the social and emotional development of young children and their caregivers to prevent and respond to ACEs. The third is to invest in building resilience to address ACEs in Kansas children. The fourth is to create guidance and structures for all program types to reach and support families that speak a language other than English at home. The fifth is to provide accessible screening of parents and children for behavioral health and developmental needs. And the final recommendations is to engage in strategies to specifically address interfamily violence.
This is Anthony Lewis. On number 4, I know it was mentioned somewhere else in the report, individuals that speak a language not all families speak. So it's a way for us to honor our families that may use American Sign Language. I don't know how that would be worded.
I think that's a good addition.
Could we just change the word speak to use?
Any other questions or additions? That was a good one.
Next section is juvenile justice system. This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. And in this particular section, several judges came together. Judge Centeno brought those judges together, and they worked for a number of days on some recommendations after our education meeting, subcommittee meeting. Commissioner Centeno, well, I can read through these. Would you like to proceed with reading through the recommendations that you played a great deal of effort in putting together?
I can do that. This is Judge Centeno from Cedric County. The first recommendation.
I'm not sure that your microphone is fully working. Is it on fully?
It's on. It's blue.
Now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I got to get right up on it. Okay. So the first one just says that promote alternatives to suspensions for disciplines such as alternative schools, behavioral interventions, family case managers, and restorative justice programs. One of the big things that both of the judges talked about during their presentation, and I'm speaking about Judge Hogan in Cedric County and retired Judge James Burgess, was that a lot of times the school systems were calling the police instead of dealing with issues internally. If a child displayed some type of behavioral problem, the first gut reaction was to call 911. So that's why we have that recommendation there. And that's what they saw in Cedric County. The second one says disaggregate statewide juvenile detention center data by race and county to further examine the pipeline and invest supports in neighborhoods and schools feeding that pipeline. Both of the judges were very clear that this pipeline does exist. And the only way that we can eliminate this pipeline is to have the data that shows exactly where this pipeline starts. One of the judges, particularly Judge Hogan, talked to me after the presentation about one particular school that she saw a lot of cases, criminal cases on children coming from. So that would, and of course, that's not the only school that was doing it, but that was the biggest one in her mind. So this would help to support tackling the pipeline in those particular areas. The third one is encourage partnership and mentoring between schools that feed the pipeline and educators who work in the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex. I think this is an overall theme that we've seen throughout this commission is partnering with others. I may know something, but the person to my right may know a little bit more or something different. So that's just a continuation of that theme. The fourth one says implement and promote rehabilitation programs to reduce recidivism upon which offenders reenter the criminal justice system. This was a big issue. Both of the judges spent a considerable amount of time talking about once a juvenile offender walks through their courtroom doors, yes, they can do certain things to deter or hopefully to deter further bad behavior. But a lot of the deterrence needs to come from the community programs. And so thus we have rehabilitative programs that should be used. 5 says expand the investment in mental health resources at the alternative schools in Kansas. I think, yet again, this is another theme that we've seen throughout this commission, that we lack in the state of Kansas adequate mental health resources, and certainly to underserved communities. 6 says invest in early childhood development programs. This was a huge issue that both of the judges continue to talk about. In fact, after the presentation, Judge Hogan sent me a link to a program that's in place that has data to support the program itself, and it's called Hawaii Healthy Start Program. And their focus really was that a lot of times intervention needs to happen a lot earlier than someone turning into a preteen or a teenager, or even elementary school. They thought that more investment money needed to go into those early intervention programs, talking about 3, 4-year-olds. So that's how we got that. The 7th one says, set regular meetings with school counselors to gain a better understanding of problems facing juveniles. Again, this is, making your community your hub for discussing the problems and understanding the problems that face children in your community. I think one thing that wasn't on here that I'd like to see included was Judge Hogan and I talked for at least 30 minutes just on this one topic of how schools should stop the zero tolerance policies that some schools are still implementing. It doesn't help the children, and it certainly doesn't help restorative programs. We also spent a lot of time talking about that schools should consider the individual child's issues, not necessarily the behavior that they're exhibiting, but the individual child's issues and behavior, and then take appropriate action from there. Her thought was that that would eliminate a lot of this pipeline. And as I was coming up here, Judge Hogan did call me on the phone, and she wanted to express her happiness that she was able to participate, because quite often juvenile judges aren't necessarily asked many questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Judge Centeno. I wonder this is Dr. Anderson, co-chair, on that first one where we have promote alternative to suspensions. I wonder if the beginning of that sentence is to stop zero tolerance practices and then continue with promote alternatives such as, because the alternative to zero tolerance are these other kinds of things. And as we talk about the judges and that work, in addition to that, through the education subcommittee, there was some disaggregation of data for the Juvenile Detention Center, conversations with Judge Centeno and myself just about, again, programs that work that are proven and what they're doing, and then some pilot programs. So would that get to that comment, starting number 1, perhaps differently?
This is Judge Centeno. Yes, I think it does. I think that works perfectly. And Kate, I did send, I think I included you in the email for that website on Hawaii Healthy Start program, and I can resend it to you. I think that should be included because it gives an example of a program that actually works, an early development program that actually works.
Are there any questions or comments on this piece? Commissioner Lewis?
Yes, this is Anthony Lewis, Superintendent Lawrence Public Schools. Would it be appropriate to include, in addition to the zero tolerance language, recommendations for school systems to examine their behavior policies, behavior matrices, to remove subjective language from those policies, i.e. disobedience, defiance, disrespect, which is the #1 reasons that many students of color are being suspended?
Yeah, and Commissioner Lewis, I think that's almost another standalone items, and it's so significant. This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair, that we add in a statement. So can you, it starts with the word remove, but can you restate that sentence as Mrs. Davis jots down that language?
Remove subjective language from, and different school districts call them different things. Sometimes they're called behavior matrices or discipline code of conducts. Remove subjective language, and if you want to include some examples, i.e. Defiance, disrespect, disobedience, Those are normally the subjective ones, because when we look at data, our white students are suspended for more objective things, like bringing a lighter to school or something like that.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, sir, Chief Ramsey.
This is Gordon Ramsey from Wichita. I just wanted to point out that in the last year, particularly, we've seen some real changes in youth violence, issues around mental health. It seems to be exacerbated by COVID and the issues surrounding it. I don't know if my friends in the schools have seen these issues. I can tell you since September, we have detained almost, I think we're up to 15 juvenile males for murder or attempted murder. Last week, we had a 14-year-old shoot and kill a 16-year-old. We're seeing significant violence, and often around youth that have no one in their lives and no resources and help. And, you know, I feel that this effort and these comments are good direction, but I don't know if everybody is aware of the significant issues that we're seeing. And that I think those outside of the education system and criminal justice system, I don't know if everybody is aware of this growing trend. And it should be on everybody's radar.
Chief Ramsey, this is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Chief Ramsey, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that a big piece of that is making sure that we have those strong connections to mentors and to educators within the school system, as well as the strong mental health connections that are a big part of the behavioral health recommendations that are a part of this report. So I think that we haven't directly addressed it, but we've addressed a number of the factors that I think would hopefully help reduce that long term if these recommendations see the uptake that we're hoping to have them see.
This is Co-Chair Anderson. I wonder, on the heels of Chief Ramsey's comment, on number 2, where it says disaggregate statewide juvenile detention center data by race and invest support in neighborhoods and schools feeding the pipeline. Before we invest, perhaps we need to make them aware, educate and invest, you know, so that there is the awareness of what we're talking about. And then on number 5, where we have expand the investment in mental health resources at the alternative schools, perhaps to Commissioner Lewis's comment, Dr. Lewis and Chief Ramsey, maybe it just needs to expand mental health resources at schools, you know, K-12 schools. So it's alternative schools, and I mean, it is under the juvenile justice piece, but we're talking about mental health in prison. We're talking about mental health at alternative schools. So whatever that tweaking of language, there is a program since being on the commission and learning some of the needs and the models just to pilot it, and we don't have anything in here about supporting pilot or even proven programs to reduce issues and address mental health. We don't really have that in there, and I don't know if we need to repeat it here. But we, taking what much of your judges shared, Mrs. Judge Centinel and I kind of talked about a program which now is in its pilot stage, only a month in. It's called a HOPE, Healing Over Prison Experiences. Hired an individual, put them in the juvenile detention center. They spend half day there, half day at the elementary. And then all of these other issues, being the connection, it's a retired African-American male principal, seeing about, you know, putting these things in action, but that takes dollars. So I don't know that everyone has dollars to pilot things that might cost. Some of these things don't, and we have partnering, but just food for thought, not offering new language, but keeping in mind that we need to urge people to do something different beyond just training and changing policy in that regard. If there are no questions, Commissioner McCormick?
Yeah, this is Commissioner McCormick. Chief, I wanted to ask you specifically, did you have any issues with zero tolerance policies, just given what you do for a living?
Commissioner McCormick, so we talked a little bit about this last year in the criminal justice. Zero tolerance policies are problematic, with exceptions of guns. I do think that, when I talk with my partners in education, that's kind of a line. But for the most part, zero tolerance policies can be problematic and need to be closely monitored if they're there. You know, as I've said and said last year, from the police perspective, we do not want to be called on policy violations or young children getting involved in issues at school. But it happens, and it happens more than anybody knows. When you call 911, oftentimes there's this obligation that our officers feel that they should go. We do have a pilot project going that's been going on for 2 years with DCF, where you'd be amazed at the number of people that call, particularly single moms that are struggling, that say, my 10-year-old isn't going to school today, and call 911 and expect the police to respond. Now our caseworkers from DCF that are embedded in the police department respond on those, and we're seeing much better outcomes.
So how is that funded? This is Dr. Anderson, to the point of the pilot programs getting the funding so that if it's grant funded, it's going to end. So how is that funded?
DCF supplies the positions, and then we supply vehicles and equipment and workspace.
So it's not a grant that'll end.
I don't believe
It's
so.
a partnership.
Yep, correct.
Thank you.
So this is Commissioner Centeno. I wanted to talk about number 7 a little bit. I did receive a correction. Judge Hogan wanted this sentence to be more about educating the legislature. So she suggested the legislature should gain a better understanding of the problems facing juveniles by having annual or biannual meetings with school counselors. It's much more specifics, but which I think is appropriate, but it really gets at the heart of the problems, right? Who's better apt to educate the legislatures than the actual counselors in the schools? So I'd like to see that change. Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we turn this green as we move into the 4:43 hour? Turn it over to the co-chair on maximizing federal funding.
And I will take the first one here and then turn it over to Commissioner Jordan for some of the final ones. But this first one comes from the Economic Subcommittee asking us to repeal restrictions that prevent families from accessing TANF and SNAP benefits and disproportionately impact families of color. I'll turn it over to you, Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you, Chair. The second recommendation is to focus on social determinants of health and equity in the CAN-CARE managed care reprocurement process. The state will undergo a new contracting process for Medicaid, and we want to recommend that we focus on social determinants of health as a state. The next recommendation is to explore opportunities for innovations and improvement within the CAN-CARE program to better serve underserved populations. And the third recommendation is to improve the use of care teams and alternative providers.
Are there any questions, comments, or additions for this section? Go ahead, Secretary Burns-Wallace.
So one thing we may look at is, so again, it's a section that I referenced earlier, but we weren't talking about today. We have a section earlier in the report that is called Federal Legislation and Funding. And it is, when you read through it, I have the full one in front of me, it is all ARPA. So it starts by saying, the American Rescue Plan Act and da-da-da-da-da. And then here we have a section that's maximizing federal funding. My recommendation is that we actually kind of bring it together because ARPA is only one, as we were talking about. The infrastructure bill is more to come. These all are examples of opportunities to maximize federal funding, and ARPA is one opportunity to maximize federal funding. So however we word it, I just think bringing those two sections together. I don't want to, there is some specificity in that earlier section because ARPA has discretionary dollars that the state is currently considering the utilization for. The way that recommendation reads is very strong to ask the committee, which is called the SPARK Committee, which I also sit on, to consider these things as they are considering the discretionary federal dollars. So I say that to say I'm asking as we bring these together, leave that section whole, don't change it, but to bring the recommendations from this section and that section and put them all together, and then maybe tweak a little bit of the intro paragraph that starts with maximizing federal funds to denote, the recovery dollars and equity as well as other existing dollars. Does that make sense?
That's a fantastic recommendation. Thank you. If there are no objections to turning those green, we have approved all of our recommendations for this final report. So just so we all have a sense of how things will move forward from here. Ms. Davis will take some of the tweaking and some of the additions and add that to the report draft, and then we'll circulate that just for any minor edits, but this will go to the governor at the beginning of December.
With that report going to the governor at the beginning of December, this is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. We'll want to talk a little bit about rollout for a few minutes here, and what that rollout may look like. So in past, we've met with various groups. For those that are new, we've entertained a meeting with legislators and other individuals, which the co-chair and I spoke to and probably will again. But Commissioner Jordan, I'll kind of turn it over to you, as you had ideas of webinars and some other items, and then others that have ideas about the rollout this time, feel free to share those. Commissioner Jordan?
Thank you, Co-Chair Anderson. One item that I talked with the co-chairs about to possibly help roll out this group of recommendations is to hold a series of webinars that any of our organizations could sponsor. The Health Fund's happy to deal with the logistics. To present the legislative recommendations, maybe the middle of the month of December in partnership with the Quad Caucus, to present the administrative recommendations in January in partnership with the League of Municipalities and the counties. We'd need to ask them, but that was, if everyone thought that was a good idea. And then to present the administrative recommendations in February, and to do a series of webinars where we could ask any of the commissioners and organizations we're associated with, and any other partner organizations to co-sponsor, so we could build a strong distribution list and roll out these recommendations sort of month by month over the next 3 months to get out to a wide array of audiences.
Dr. Anderson, is everyone on board with Commissioner Jordan's recommendation? So we will plan accordingly with the webinars separated into categories. Are there other thoughts about the rollout and how we might share this report? Commissioner Lewis?
Yes, this is Anthony Lewis. As different organizations are gearing up to craft their legislative priorities, I think this will be an excellent opportunity for inclusion of some of our recommendations into legislative priorities.
Anderson, co-chair. So as we meet with the Quad legislative group, and as we accept and invite other commissioners to attend any other opportunities to speak to legislators before they're fully in session, we certainly can highlight areas that we would like to see immediate traction on in that regard. I would suggest op-eds were a big piece last time and seemed to get quite a bit of attention. And for those that would like to write those by category, I'd encourage that to still continue, and turn it over to Co-Chair Portillo and I'm sorry, Dr. Davis to pick up from there.
Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. I think that, especially because a lot of this stuff is, I guess I'm biased for the economic portion of it, would it be advantageous for us to get endorsement from local economic associations, local business councils and things like that, to put, these entities who are actually hiring and paying people are supporting these economic initiatives?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I think that the idea of engaging with economic development councils and potentially chambers, and to take a look at what kinds of endorsements we can garner. We worked closely with the Governor's Tax Policy Council, and I think that sharing this back with them and other councils as well would make a lot of sense. We also do have an opportunity. We don't have to come up with all of the brilliant ideas this afternoon. We have an opportunity in December, once the report has been approved, to have a conversation about kind of rollout and next steps at our meeting in December. So this is just starting that brainstorming process and asking you all to think hard about this. And as Dr. Anderson mentioned, we have, and as Dr. Lewis mentioned, we have a number of organizations that are putting their legislative priorities together right now. So as we're thinking about local governments who will be thinking up their legislative priorities, school districts, and how are we communicating these recommendations as those entities are considering their own legislative priorities?
Co-Chair Dr. Anderson, so knowing that we'll be meeting again and bringing ideas again, I think that kind of leads us into this very final piece as we prepare to conclude. I will say on Dr. Davis's recommendation, it may not be a bad idea. We didn't do this last time, but perhaps this time, literally, as soon as it's approved in December, sending the link to all chambers across at least our entities. In our county, it'd be the Greater Topeka Partnership. But having that just as a step, that they all get the report. We ask them to take a look at the economic piece, to invite us in to have conversation. I think that might be a nice step in December, period, for all of those entities. With that, and I believe Commissioner Dupree, District Attorney Dupree, are you still on the line?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Well, we had jazz music in the hall and sweet potato pie, 4 of them, in fact, but you're not here, so that is really interesting. Along
My
with
heart
the,
is hurt. My heart is hurt. And you know, duty calls. I'm doing my duty. But I
oh my
promise I'm
goodness.
going to get to Topeka to get some of that after a while.
I'm going to give it to Dr. New to see if she can get that to you, along with Commissioner Portilla and myself left you all your personalized ornament that was created specifically with an emblem and a picture of the Brown v. Board case and an emblem of our CREJ commission. So we hope you enjoy it as you add it to your tree and or whatever, wherever you add it to, as we prepare to see you in December. I'm going to turn it back
Thank you
over
so
to
much.
our co-chair. You are so welcome, but that's the last time I'm bringing sweet potato pie. Luckily, a retired principal, Dr. Gordon, helped me out with that, or I'd be a little bothered today.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Before we excuse ourselves to the hallway to have delicious sweet potato pie, I do ask that we all take a quick picture so that we can have something other than Zoom boxes for this particular report. So if we could stay in here, gather and take a picture, and then we will have some treats and desserts before we head out for the evening.
And then for those commissioners that are online, we're just going to crop your Zoom boxes right on into that photo, all right? And with that, again, as we close on out, I just want to say thank you. It really is. Yeah, I almost wanted to clap when Dr. Portilla said this concludes our report. It's tremendous that we've been together for 2 years, and now just seeing each other for the first time, you look different in person. It has been wonderful working through some very difficult but powerful work that we know is legacy building work that will change some systems across Kansas. So thank you for all of your work, and I just think at this point, congratulations at this point for all of us and what we've done here, and all others who are watching who invested. Co-Chair Portilla, any final comment as we adjourn?
I just want to say ditto. Yeah, this is ongoing work. And so as we move forward with the report, I think that we'll have many conversations still to come around these recommendations. And I do just want to say thank you because we have asked for so many hours and so many read-throughs of so many recommendations, and deeply, deeply appreciate all of the time put into this work and all of the time that we will continue to put into advocating for these recommendations as we move forward in the next phase. So thank you all.
This concludes the meeting. We are adjourned.